This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome everybody. Sorry about the hiatus. Sarah had very correctly gone to the place she thought she was talking in and was rather glad to find both the door locked and nobody there. So she'll be very relieved to see you all sitting here. I think we should begin with, are there any announcements that anybody has that they wish to make to the assembled throng? No announcements. That's your first. Right, okay, so we have no announcements. So it's a very great pleasure to welcome Sara Slinn at the University of Lincoln, who I've known for many years. It's a bit ungallant to say that, but I first met you when you were at the Borthwick Institute, and where so did an absolutely fantastic edition of the records relating to ordination in New York papers. And ever since, I think it's grown into a really original project about professions, which I had the pleasure of examining as a doctoral thesis. And it's one of those doctoral theses where you want to just stand up and applaud at the end. So I think you'll find this really interesting. Sorry, but it's an absolutely fascinating project, not just if you're interested in the clergy, but I think for all kinds of other perspectives on the period. So I hope you will enjoy it. And it's called Northern Lights and Welsh Peasants.
Okay.
Over to you, Sarah.
Right. Thank you very much. This evening I'm going to try and reintroduce you to the clergy of late Hanoverian England and Wales, a group of men who have been by no means neglected by historians of the church or of the professions, but who in some regards I think have been a little misrepresented, particularly in terms of the homogeneity of their cultural and educational backgrounds, a view, for instance, exemplified by Peter Virgin's statement some years ago in his study of 18th and 19th century church, that the clergy shared a common culture based upon a common education provided by the grammar schools or by the private tutor, and then by Oxford and Cambridge universities. And in the most recent substantial volume on the clerical body of the period, Bill Jacobs, who's here tonight, his 2007 Clerical Profession in the Long 18th Century, he included a really good summary of what historians for a number of decades now have understood to have been the educational backgrounds of the clergy. Most clergy were graduates. There were exceptions, but in general, during the period after the Reformation, the English reformers' ambition to achieve a graduate, if not learned, clergy was achieved. The exceptions were mostly in the north, especially the northwest and southwest Wales. Tonight I shall by no means topple this well-established view, but I will be suggesting that when thinking about the clergy, those hands and mouths of the establishment in the localities, we need to be a bit more cautious about how we construct our mental ideal types and allow the exceptions to the rule to be given greater weight and to be integrated somehow into our picture of the 18th century church, its personnel, its pulpit and pastoral ministry, and more generally of local social relations. So the basic structure this evening is as follows. I'm going to explain a little bit about my research and its methodology. Then I'm going to share some data concerning recruitment of the Anglican clergy in the late Hanoverian period. Then I'm going to talk about how young men actually went about preparing for orders without going to university. And then I'll finish up with a few comments on what this might mean more broadly. As Arthur mentioned, this research had its origin in an archival infrastructural project which dealt with the ordination records of the Diocese of York. And whilst working on the marvellously detailed bundles of ordination application papers, it became clear to me that much could be done with the hundreds and hundreds of accounts written by candidates, their fathers and friends, about the routes they'd taken since boyhood to prepare themselves to become clergymen of the Church of England. What I learnt from these papers was this: in the massive York diocese, non-graduate clergy were not rare, nor exceptional, nor were they confined to areas that might be deemed remote or unpleasant in some way. Quite simply, they formed a very significant proportion of the clerical workforce. What then, I wondered, was going on in neighbouring dioceses? Would recruitment trends in one diocese be mirrored in others? Might a change in ordination policy in one have an impact on its neighbours? Working through the Durham ordination records, I again found non-graduates to be very common, but moving on to Chester and Carlisle, I hit a brick wall. The Carlisle papers had been destroyed by bombing in World War II, And the Chester records were, from my point of view, functionally destroyed due to an unfortunate decision about the arrangement of the diocesan archive. Having met this dead end, it was with great delight I learnt about the Clergy of the Church of England database project, the brainchild of Arthur Burns, Stephen Taylor and Ken Fincham. By now, some of you will realise how long I've been plugging away at this. And this offered the opportunity to expand my research, and over a number of years, CCED enabled me to pull together basic but essential lists of names and dates of ordinations, which I could then use to go back and access other archival collections. Eventually, I was able to detail the educational backgrounds of every man who took Anglican orders between 1780 and 1840, and in doing so, I think I've created the first large-scale prosopographical study of the education of the Anglican clergy. I spent a little time talking about the evolution and basic methodology of this research because I want to emphasise that it's been built up from the level of the individual ordinand and from the archival record. It has been able to uncover national and subnational trends in ordination and has revealed educational systems and networks operating outside the university. The project was not, however, conceived of as a study of a profession or a professionalisation, nor of clerical vocation, and neither does the work as it stands directly address the socio-economic background of Anglican clergy, although clearly is highly suggestive and does have much to offer such discussions. So, what can a study about the educational backgrounds of the clergy of the Church of England tell us? It's worked. Right. I've put this little map on this side here, just in case, for those of you who aren't that familiar with diocesan geography, and why should you be? The green or blue bit at the top is actually the northern province, and the little sort of leg that comes down is actually Nottinghamshire. That helps you orientate yourself. The rest of it is the southern province. I've shaded the 4 Welsh dioceses in a darker shade, but they were in the southern province. Okay. So, overall, it was possible to identify just under 22,000 men who took deacon's orders, deacon being the entry point of Anglican orders, in the period 1780 to 1840. The blue line shows a sort of trend for the whole church, England and Wales. And the number of ordinations per decade increased over the period, but not in a steady way. There is this distinctive downturn in the sort of 1790s and 1800s. I haven't got time tonight to talk about what was behind this dip or driving the broadly upward trend, which will probably be a relief to those of you who don't like number crunching, but suffice to say there were many and varied factors acting on the need for clergy. Changing benefice values, legislation affecting residence, plurality, curate stipends, the creation of new roles as a result of new places of worship and changing conceptions of the ministry, and 2, probably life cycle factors relating to the age structure of the workforce. I will just make 2 points though. The first is that if we drill down a bit into the data, these trends were not uniform across the diocese. Whatever was behind the ups and downs did not operate equally everywhere. For example, although overall an increasing demand for clergy shows most strongly in the 1820s, it was actually in the previous decade that impact had been felt in the northern province. It's a bit hard to tell on this diagram, but the line is actually steeper for the northern province in that early period. And if we're to drill down even to an even lower level, we would see that the differences between the dioceses can be fairly extreme. So whilst in the 1810s London increased recruitment by 146% over the previous decade, its neighbour Winchester, which included urban areas of London south of the Thames, only increased by 8%, and Peterborough diocese actually decreased by 30%. The various dioceses could react very differently to stimuli as a result not only of their internal economic and demographic characteristics, but also because of the way their bishops responded. So that's a rough outline of what was happening with recruitment in general. I'm now going to turn to the educational background of the clergy. Right, and these are the headline results. The diocese with the highest proportions of non-graduates, that's the blue bits in the bar, let me see if my head, were St David's, Sodor and Man, very tiny diocese, Carlisle, Llandaff, York, Durham and Chester. Nothing surprising here at all about fingering St David's and Chester dioceses as places where non-graduates were common. These are the dioceses usually referred to when people mention exceptions to the graduate-only rule. But I think previous studies have perhaps not really taken into account how extensive the non-graduate culture of Northern England and Southern Wales was. And sometimes the distribution of clergy has been articulated in ways that haven't been very helpful. It makes no sense to describe the whole of the Northern Province and South Wales as remote or outlying, or to suggest it wasn't typical. The Northern Province, for instance, included about 30% of England's landmass, and in 1831 had 31% of its souls. These areas are simply too big and too populous to disregard in formulations of what might have been typical or average. But this does rather give the impression that non-graduates were a Northern and Southern Welsh phenomenon. This isn't the whole story. If we look at the 1780s, for instance, non-graduates were being recruited to some extent in all dioceses. Again, the blue are the non-graduates. Okay. And this shows where 25% or more of the ordinands did not have degrees at the point of ordination. Notice that whereas we might have already expected St Asaph here and Hereford, university men were actually in the minority at this point. The trend over the period was for the southern dioceses to become increasingly dominated by graduate entrants. Indeed, many bishops explicitly began to require a degree as an essential qualification, and the areas which non-graduates might reasonably hope to be ordained shrank fairly dramatically, as these two maps show. Okay, so the darker the green, the more graduates there are. Okay, but I should highlight a couple of complicating factors and caveats. Firstly, talking about non-graduate clergy in terms of their proportions in ordination cohorts can be a little bit misleading because the provinces and dioceses were so very different in terms of size. In actual fact, in absolute terms, more non-graduates were ordained in the southern province than in the northern province, even though they formed a very much smaller proportion of the southern recruits. To give an example, in the very large diocese of Norwich, 345 non-graduates were ordained over the period, compared to 315 in the small diocese of Carlisle. In Carlisle they predominated, in Norwich they were a small minority. That's the first point. Non-graduate clergy were not confined to the north, they were ordained in significant numbers in the south. Secondly, we also need to keep in mind that just because we know where non-graduates were ordained in the greatest numbers or the greatest proportions, we do not know for certain where non-graduate clergy worked in the greatest proportions or numbers. With some exceptions, new clergy, after a year or so in a curacy, had freedom of movement. Non-graduates did not necessarily stay where they were ordained. This could sometimes cause local resentment. In 1743, a Lancashire clergyman warned the Archbishop of York that a whole colony of homebred poor raw boys were coming into York Diocese to seek their fortunes. He was referring to men who were already ordained. In 1823, the Bishop of Lincoln's secretary complained of a man who had applied for a curacy that he was illiterate, another word for a non-graduate, from the north, and a cheap Hyperborean who was forestalling other men who had a superior right to clerical employment since they had spent more money on their educations. I am not suggesting that masses of Northern and Welsh non-graduate clergy spent their lives trying to move into Southern English dioceses. Although much more work needs to be done on clerical migration, it seems clear that the dioceses that ordained the greatest numbers and proportions in the general of non-graduates also have them in their workforces. I am, however, suggesting we need to be cautious. Even in dioceses where bishops barred non-graduates, they might still be found in curacies and benefices, having moved into the diocese after ordination. So non-graduate clergy were not exclusively a feature of the Northern Province or South Wales, but they were certainly a very significant proportion here. Why was the clerical culture here so very different? Two explanations are typically offered which clearly have a bearing on the issue. Firstly, in dioceses where there were very many poor benefices, the rectories and vicarages, and consequently very many poor curacies, the rectors and vicars not having much money to expend in employing assistants, it is assumed that it was difficult to attract university-educated men, since they expected or needed respectable stipends, and the Northern Province and Wales were rich in poverty. Secondly, university graduates were reluctant to take employment at a distance from Oxford, Cambridge or London, the assumption here being that graduates continued to wish to be near their alma maters and that their social lives found their centre of gravity in the south of the country. It's also been suggested that another deterrent for going north was a difference in the nature of ministries. Parishes in the upland Pennine and Lakeland regions of the Northern Province tended to be exceedingly large. The winters could be harsh, and unless wealthy enough to keep a horse, and many curates weren't, there would have been lots of trudging up and down hills and along sloughy roads in the wind and the rain. And in the growing industrial settlements of the north, clergy faced lonely ministries amongst masses of displaced and disorientated labourers. As Alan Haig has noted, the church's work, quite simply, was usually harder in the north. In South Wales, where the same issues applied, the scarceness of Welsh-speaking graduates acted as an additional barrier to graduate recruitment. These intuitive explanations make sense, but they by no means explain the distribution of graduate and non-graduate clergy revealed by this study. For instance, neither Exeter or Bangor diocese were rich, and neither was convenient for a trip to the universities or to London. And yet from the 1790s, both dioceses were able to exclude almost all non-graduates. How were they able to do this? The answer, I think, lies in the fact that these dioceses had a sufficient provision of adequately endowed scholarships from their grammar schools to university, namely Exeter College and Jesus College, Oxford. The Northern Diocese and those of South Wales did not enjoy such educational endowments to the same extent. And there's an additional factor which needs to be considered. In the North and South Wales, laymen, clergy and bishops did not necessarily regard non-graduate clergy as second best, only to be accepted in default of graduates. And since it was the parish clergy who selected the next generation of clergy by deciding who they would offer titles to, that a title being that all-important offer of a job necessary before a man could apply for ordination, if the parish clergy offered titles to non-graduates, then a non-graduate culture could be sustained as long as the bishops were content. At the point when the parish clergy began to prefer graduates, and at the point at which the bishops began to exert strong pressure on them to choose university-educated men, then the non-graduate clerical culture would be eroded, providing, of course, there were enough graduates to fill all the available positions. This is indeed what happened in the Northern Province. Not only did the clergy seem to have increasingly come to favour graduates, from 1825 the bishops, who had previously been content with non-graduates, fell in with a plan of incoming Bishop of Chester, C.J. Blomfield, to bring the Northern Province in line with southern practice, proposing henceforth to accept only graduates, plus a few non-graduates from the new clerical college at St Bees, which had opened in 1817. To some extent, Blomfield's plan worked. From this point on, the proportion of graduates ordained increased, but his plan was based on an ungrounded assumption that the universities were producing enough graduates to supply the needs of the whole church, which they weren't. However, by the time this became clear to his brother bishops, Blomfield had moved on to London, leaving them to deal with the problem. I'm now going to turn to a consideration of the nature of non-graduate education. There were three basic types of non-graduate ordinands. Those who were primarily self-educated, perhaps with help from family and friends. This was an important route, but it was by its nature one which did not create extended networks, and tonight I'm not really going to talk about it. Then there were men who prepared for ordination in specialist grammar schools. Thirdly, there were ordinands who studied with specialist tutors, who were usually also parish clergymen, and it's with the latter two routes I'm concerned. The basic educational requirement for ordination were laid down by Canon 34. It was required of an ordinand that he hath taken some degree of school in either of the said universities, or at the least, except he be able to yield an account of his faith in Latin, according to the articles of religion, and to confirm the same by sufficient testimonies out of the Holy Scriptures. At this period, what happened in practice was that a candidate made a paper-based application to the bishop of the diocese in which he had an offer of a job. That was the title I was talking about. And if considered suitable, he would be invited to examination and interview, after which, if he passed, he would be ordained. Whilst there are many oft-repeated anecdotal examples of sloppy examination, a general survey reveals that examinations required significant preparation, were administered strictly, and that failure was not uncommon. Here is an example. This is an exercise to translate a short piece of the Gospel of Matthew from Greek into Latin. Additionally, candidates might be asked to write an essay or a sermon on a set theme, often one of the articles. Some sat written divinity and church history papers. There might also be oral exercises. And besides the academic part of the exam, there was usually an interview with the bishop where personal and spiritual aspects of the role might be discussed. Now, it was the requirement for a moderate competency in Latin and Greek which was the defining feature of a would-be ordinand's education. The divinity part could really be got up by cramming. Almost all had a classical or liberal education at a grammar school or with a private tutor. Those that went on to Oxford University would then have continued their classical studies, or at least those who cared to do so would have done. There seemed to be a sizable contingent who did very little, aided by a rather lax assessment scheme. Those who went to Cambridge focused on mathematics. Here there was little incentive for students to continue classical studies. The consequence was that although the best of the university graduates were impressive, the vast majority of university men were also rands, some of whom had not advanced very much from their school days. I mentioned that the basic underpinning skills necessary for an ordinand to prepare himself, moderate ability and Latin and Greek, would have been laid down in the usual liberal boyhood education. Of course, not all boys had such educations. Of those parents who could afford schooling, many chose instead a commercial education, focusing on the skills needed for business. But the endowed grammar schools, liberally scattered through towns and villages, meant that many boys gained a classical education, and indeed there were many places where classical schooling was the cheapest on offer. Much has been written about the decline of the grammar schools in the 18th century, showing that parents increasingly began to regard Greek and Latin as having little utility for sons who needed to earn a living. But the grammar schools were not yet everywhere in terminal decline, and in southern Wales and the northern province, whilst a young man might still be ordained without the added expense of a university education, it remained worthwhile for even quite ordinary parents to give a son a classical education. Now, because of the expense of keeping an economically unproductive son until he was 23, the earliest age for ordination, these parents were unlikely to have been from the poorest sort, although they may well have been drawn from occupational groups that professional and elite families thought rather debasing to the clerical order. W.J. Conybeare, for instance, looking back in 1853 on the non-graduate clergy of England and Wales earlier in the century, termed them peasant clergy of the mountains. Less acerbic commentators would have described such men as coming from yeoman stock, cultivators of small estates rather than wage labourers, and the ordination records show that many were the sons of skilled artisans and prosperous tradesmen, schoolmasters, and clergy too poor to afford to send their sons, or at least all of their sons, to university. For such families, the cost of educating a son for the church seems to have been equivalent to the cost of apprenticing him to a provincial surgeon, equipping him for sea, or apprenticing him to a trade in London. A disdain for non-graduate clergy was, however, fairly widespread amongst university-going classes, even if not necessarily amongst the northern and Welsh clergy themselves or their parishioners. Contemporary polemic tends to depress their social origins. Conybeare was not the only commentator to describe such men as peasants. It had a fairly long pedigree. In 1819, a correspondent to the Gentleman's Magazine, going by the telling name of Oxoniensis, recycled criticisms voiced earlier in 1783 using the dismissive term Northern Lights, and blaming the free schools of the northern counties for, he said, allowing free instruction of the classics, which only served to puff up the ambitions of the peasantry. I don't have time to talk more about the print discourse, which almost demonised clergy educated outside the sphere of the universities as Northern Lights and Welsh Peasants, unfit for the pulpit, or in the terms of one critic, more fit to make a pulpit than to get into one. But I will just return to the image on my title slide and reveal another instance of the Welsh clergy depicted as a rustic. This comes from a satirical print of 1795, which took the form of a doggerel clerical alphabet. So what were these ordinand educating grammar schools like then? Well, in South Wales, there's evidence that preparing for orders at grammar school was the usual way of doing things throughout the 18th century. And curiously, many Anglican clergy seem to have been educated in dissenting academies. And it may well be this fact that they were being trained outside Anglican orthodoxy which attracted the notice of the bishops, since from the 1780s in St David's diocese, specific schools were formally designated as divinity schools at which ordinands were authorised to study. Over the period, such schools can be found in many of the diocese's major towns. And from the episcopate of Samuel Horsley, who arrived in 1788, and possibly a bit before, the masters were supplied with appropriate courses of instruction and were required to keep watch on the moral, social, physical and academic suitability of the students. Some were long in standing endowed grammar schools, but two of the most successful were, in effect, private enterprises. Ystrad Muirig was the foundation of its first master, Edward Richard, who developed the school from the 1750s. It was actually a double-pronged enterprise, since his mother was an innkeeper who provided the student accommodation. Eliza Williams' School at Lampeter was founded with the encouragement of the bishop in his dilapidated glebe house. These licensed divinity schools operated until the opening of St David's College, Lampeter, in 1827, which was the pet project of Bishop Thomas Burgess, aimed at giving the Welsh a sort of Oxbridge-type education and making them a bit more English. In neighbouring Llandaff diocese, there was also a long-standing tradition of grammar school education of ordinands harnessed by the bishops. Here, schools at Cowbridge, Usk and Abergavenny were recognised as having divinity schools or classes. They would survive longer than those in St David's, the last probably coming to an end in about 1847, when Jesus College, Oxford, the patrons of Cowbridge, appointed a non-Welsh speaking master. The schools were under active oversight of the bishops through the intermediary of Welsh speaking Chancellor of Llandaff, Bruce Knight, who regularly visited the schools, examined the students and reported their aptitudes and failings to the bishops. Unlike the schools of St David's and Llandaff, the grammar schools of Westmoreland and Cumberland never came under direct supervision, probably because the diocesan geography was so complicated in this area. It was difficult to know which of the bishops, Carlisle or Chester, had the most interest in them. The most significant were at St Bees, which lay in Cumberland in Chester diocese, and Bampton and Ravenstone, which lay in Westmoreland and Carlisle diocese. But many other grammar schools in this region had the reputation of having educated significant numbers of clergy in the 18th century. The business was even significant enough to encourage private enterprise. At Keswick in 1786, Joseph Edmondson advertised he could teach for commerce or the church. And in 1791, John Brown opened a school in Carlisle to train for orders or university. Evidence of schools outside this relatively small area is rather scarce. I rather suspect that in the middle of the 18th century, Sedbergh and Richmond grammar schools, both in northern Yorkshire, were acting in a similar way. And in 1782, David Lloyd opened a school in Northumberland to prepare for universities and holy orders, encouraged, he said, by Bishop John Egerton. Although the bishops did not directly oversee or intervene in the schools, they did concern themselves with the nature of the masters and the quality of the teaching, as is clear from this 1778 charge of Bishop Porteous to his clergy of Chester diocese. He said this: "Such of you more especially as have the care of schools in which young men are educated for the church without going to either of our universities should for the last 2 or 3 years of their continuance with you put such books in their hands as may prepare them properly for the business they had in view." And Bishops Porteous and Cleaver and Barrington of Durham published guidance and reading lists to ordinands, and it seems likely these guided the specialist schools. These North Country schools continued their business until the opening of St Bees Clerical College in 1817, which effectively put them out of business. What then was taught at these advanced grammar schools? Obviously, they were directly tailored to the ordination exams and focused on Latin, Greek and divinity. Students were only accepted who could, in the words of Bishop Horsley's regulations, construe the Greek Testament and the common Latin authors with tolerable facility. So such a standard, it seems likely they would already have graduated from grammar school, have done some years there, and some men of this standard would have seen their way into university. The syllabus of these schools seems to be most exacting in St David's, where Bishop Burgess came to expect the study of Hebrew, which was rather exceptional at this period. So whilst English ordinands would find themselves expected to perform translations between Latin, Greek and English, in St David's they were expected to be able to translate between Welsh, English, Latin, Greek and Hebrew. Frequently derided by English contemporaries as semi-literate, it's important to bear in mind that the scholarship of the Welsh clergy was all but invisible in the Anglophone world. Students also studied the various books of divinity, which were the fodder of ordinands everywhere, such as Grotius on the truth of Christian religion and Pearson's exposition of the Creed. At Eliza Williams School in Lampeter, founded in 1805, they studied the early Christian fathers, which at this period was somewhat untypical. Equipping poor students with suitable reading was a concern of Bishop Watson of Llandaff. In 1785 he published 6 volumes of tracts about which he said, "I meant especially to benefit by this work such young persons who have not been educated at either of our universities. Many are such in this diocese," going on to say that it afforded them a means of instruction which would not disgrace any university in the world. And in Llandaff, Bishop C.R. Sumner seems to have been concerned that ordinands should start out with a basic clerical library, requiring schools to certify that the students owned certain books. We know much less of what ordinands studied in the northern schools. However, it seems that a general grammar school education in Westmoreland was a somewhat broader affair than in many places, and boys were prepared for commerce and husbandry and the sea alongside their future pastors. At Bampton, Greek and Latin were supplemented by navigation, fortification and gunnery, and the Bampton scholars, including the future clergy, had reputations as excellent wrestlers. In this alone, I think we can see something of the cultural chasm lying between the clergy educated at the northern grammar schools and their university-educated colleagues. But if the clergy of Westmoreland enjoyed rustic sports, then conversely their schoolmates entering agricultural occupations took with them a taste for classics. The men of Bampton were said to drive their ploughs in Latin and shear their sheep in Greek. Being educated for the church was a lengthy affair. Typically, a young man from Westmoreland might attend an ordinary grammar school until he was 13 or 14, and take up a post as a teacher or usher in a small local school. Then, when he was 19 or 20, if his skills needed improving, he might return to a specialist class or school to prepare for ordination. There is some evidence that young men from outside the region might be sent to one of these specialist schools. The sons of John Atkinson, rector of Full Sutton near York, were sent to be educated in Westmoreland before being ordained back in York. The most stringent regulations applied in St David's, where under Bishop Burgess, who arrived in 1803, the ordinands were expected to spend 7 years in one of the divinity schools and never to have undertaken any paid employment. It's not possible to be certain how many ordinands prepared at the grammar schools. We do know that John Bowstead, Master of Bampton for 56 years, claimed to have educated 300 priests. I'll spare you the details of my calculation, but the schools were regionally very significant. Possibly 30% of the ordinand pool between 1780 and 1820 in the Northern Province had prepared for orders at grammar school, and probably nearly all of the Welsh non-graduates. Most grammar school students found post-ordination employment locally, but those educated in Westmoreland and Cumberland also seem to have found employment in neighbouring Durham diocese. James Raine, who was beneficed at Meldon in Northumberland and was himself a non-graduate, remarked that nearly all the curates incumbents of small Durham benefices had been educated in the schools of the western counties. and it is possible to find students ordained to titles further afield. William Beetham, born in Little Strickland and educated at Bampton, was ordained at Lincoln in 1771. John Banks, educated at Keswick, was ordained at Lincoln in 1788. But typically those who were ordained in the south seem to first have had positions as schoolmasters and ushers from which they sought orders. The men educated for orders at the Welsh grammar schools had greater difficulty seeking ordination outside their native region. And actually, it was not the language difficulties that was the greatest hurdle for them. There was a bigger hurdle of restricted diocesan policies. A number of bishops of St David's prevented men educated in divinity schools from leaving the diocese by refusing to sign their testimonials and by securing the agreement of the bishops of neighbouring Llandaff and Hereford not to accept them. If there was any justice in this, then it was that a few of them had had their education partly paid for by diocesan funds. But men educated in the Welsh schools were occasionally ordained elsewhere. Indeed, a little group of Welsh clergy formed in the West Riding of Yorkshire who were very partial to recruiting Welsh curates. Networks of association, clearly durable, formed between pupils and tutors of the schools. Masters were often applied to by incumbents, some of whom were previous pupils, to recommend curates and schoolmasters. But there was not a great deal of high-value patronage that could be transferred in these networks. This is an area, however, where I think much more work could usefully be done about the transmission of professional and theological trends amongst grammar school educated clergy. The specialist grammar schools were not the only way in which a non-graduate might set about preparing himself for orders. Many men, some of them making a career change out of occupations chosen for them in boyhood, took instructions from specialist tutors from orders. Sometimes graduates who felt unprepared or who had failed their ordination examinations might also enlist the help of these tutors, but tonight I'm specifically talking about the non-graduates. Some of them acted on a very small scale. Some of them advertised. Some were embedded in networks which would see students referred to them from all around the country. For instance, ex-schoolmaster George Hendrick was directed to study with tutor Samuel Knight, curate of Wintringham in North Lincolnshire, by Charles Simeon, who had known Knight at Cambridge. Networks of referral become particularly obvious when examining the ways in which the evangelical clerical education societies, which were founded to assist the education of poor but pious potential clergymen, sourced tuition. They could draw on the services of supporters, but in particular they were able to prevail upon those who had previously received financial support from them to assist in educating the next generation. For instance, Bristol-born John Seaton was taken under the wing of the Bristol Clerical Education Society and was placed by them with one of their ex-students, W.H. Havergal, in Worcestershire. Subsequently, the Bristol-based society were able to use links with the Yorkshire-based Elland Clerical Society to find Seaton a title for orders, and Patrick Bronte offering him a curacy. Sometimes the business of tuition seems to have passed between father and son, incumbent and curate, or between one incumbent of a parish to the next. I think possibly when they had nice, large, roomy parish houses. Samuel Knight offered tuition service nearly all his working life, but in his old age his son James took on the role. Thomas Clark of Tressembois in Buckinghamshire, who was described by a contemporary as keeping a seminary for pious youths intended for the service of the sanctuary, had a non-graduate pupil, George Campbell Broadbelt, ordained in 1783, who himself took up tuition at Aston Stanford, about 15 miles away. Broadbelt's curate, William Price, then took up tuition, as did Broadbelt's successor at Aston Stanford, Thomas Scott, the Bible commentator and pillar of the Church Missionary Society. Typically, these tutors also had parishes to look after, so tuition took the form of a few hours face-to-face tuition and the use of the tutor's library. Students often gained pastoral experience, visiting the sick, teaching Sunday school. Some tutors took only one or two men at once, perhaps just as day students. Some aspirant clergy studied along other types of men. In the 1770s, John Mastin, son of a farmer, who with a small legacy had opened a school and then decided he wanted to become a clergyman, studied with Joseph Webster, the curate of Enderby in Leicestershire, along with 3 other men preparing for orders, 1 preparing for the legal profession and 1 preparing for life as a gentleman. Although clerical tutors can be found operating throughout the country, it was in York Diocese that this kind of tuition became embedded and where it finds its most advanced state of development. Although there is evidence of extensive use of clerical tutors throughout the period, from the mid-1820s, Archbishop Venables Vernon began to formally approve activities of some and to turn away those prepared by non-authorised tutors. The most prolific of these tutors ran establishments which were in effect domestic seminaries or clerical schools. Students, perhaps half a dozen, were taken into their homes, and in addition to help with their academic studies, they were socialised into the clerical family, witness to the daily round of prayers, study and pastoral work, and grafted into their tutors' cultural, social and political world. Breakfast time at W.H. Havergill's was, for instance, a time when new books, contemporary religious issues and politics were discussed. But how then did these non-graduates compare to graduates when it came to ordination exams? Evidence suggests they acquitted themselves well. There is no evidence they failed examinations more than graduates, and sometimes they even came top, signalled by being asked to preach at an ordination service. It also seems to have been an open secret that non-graduate students were better prepared than Cambridge students. Charles Smith Bird, the popular devotional and theological author, reported an anecdote about Archbishop William Markham of York, who had died in 1807. The story goes that when he was doing his ordination examinations, he came across a very poor candidate who had been second wrangler at Cambridge. He turned to another ordinand who was even worse with the words, "Sir, I suppose you were the senior wrangler." In the 1820s, we find the examining chaplain of Bishop Jenkinson of St David's reporting that neither of those renowned seats of learning, Oxford or Cambridge, could produce an equal number of candidates better qualified in every respect than those I've had the pleasure examining. That was a public statement, but a private statement from a similar time of Bishop Coppleston of Llandaff was that they were better prepared and on the whole fitter men for the humble and ill-paid duties entrusted to them than the university candidates, and quite as well-mannered and admissible into society. Here is another example from the satirical clerical alphabet of 1795, showing quite clearly that graduate status was not universally thought of as ensuring a quality clergyman. But despite the fact their academic skills enabled them to compete well with graduates and that many had relevant work experience, and despite the fact that, as one defender of non-graduate clergy was to point out, their moral and social lives had had closer oversight, and that unlike graduates, they were unlikely to begin life with debts or enter their ministries with insupportable standards of living, it is clear that in most places graduate clergy were preferred. Even in the northern province and Wales, over the period of this study, non-graduates came to be increasingly seen as inferior and even inadequate. So what might this mean more generally? Well, the first point is that neither professional training of the clergy nor training of non-graduates was an innovation of the 19th century. Neither were the first 2 theological colleges, St Bees in Cumberland and St David's Lampeter, innovatory in the ways that have been claimed. Both were built on pre-existing modes of extra-university education. Historians of higher and theological education, I think, have been a little bit misdirected by adulatory episcopal biography and some institutional histories, aided and abetted by the fact that even during their heyday, the schools and parish clerical institutions received scant public notice. Alan Haig noted in his study of the 19th century non-graduate theological colleges that these institutions had long been neglected by historians because their existence had always been regarded as a cause for shame or regret by the Church. How much more so then the grammar schools and the parish clerical institutions. Secondly, the late Hanoverian clergy were a different kind of gentleman than has generally been assumed. Peter Virgin's statement with which we started, that the clergy shared a common culture, is only partially true. Certainly they all shared cultural references and attitudes which reflected the common classical boyhood education and the requirement of ordination exams. But they did not all share the elite habitus of the university educated. Instead, some had had a provincially, professionally focused education, but as a consequence had had less exposure to broader intellectual and cultural currents that a university man might encounter. And whilst all clergy had had a classical learning, non-graduates were not schooled in the composition of Latin or Greek verse, a skill which held a great deal of cultural prestige and which was thought of as the mark of a true scholar, even if having little practical use for a clergyman. There were other ways in which they were different, which were important to contemporaries. While socialised as gentlemen, they were very much in the provincial town-dwelling mould. Their tastes were less expensive, their social horizons much more circumscribed. Many retained regional accents, which subjected them to the disdain of those who didn't. To the elite educated, they often appeared uncouth and rustic. Certainly the social distance between pew and pulpit is likely to have been much less than often thought, particularly in the North and South Wales. The day-to-day cure of souls, it seems, was quite likely to be in the hands of a locally reared man of a respectable middling sort of background, who had not had his outlook, attitudes and tastes transformed by residence at university, or among, or at least observing, the elite. I think this offers much more scope for further exploration. There are many interesting things to be said about how parishioners perceive the effectiveness and status of their clergy. My third point is that there was a significant part of the clerical body who did not enjoy the patronage links offered by the university and felt no loyalty to them. Non-graduate clergy were not educated alongside men who had risen to positions of influence and wield patronage in their favour. They did not have access to the patronage networks of the universities. They were men who entered the church in search of a secure and competent livelihood, something better than manual work and more respectable than trade, but they did not have the social leverage to aspire to wealthy benefices, let alone the canonries, deaneries and archdeaconries, those glittering prizes, which has often been assumed by both contemporaries and historians to have been the motive force behind the choice of career. Instead, educated by specialist tutors and schoolmasters, they were embedded in other networks. These networks generally accessed and conveyed lower value resource, but were nevertheless significant. In the expansion and influence of evangelical networks, for instance, it's possible to push against the dominant historiography which has emphasised the role of Charles Simeon at Cambridge and to a lesser extent alternative nodes at Oxford University in sort of forming sort of groups of serious young men, by observing that a great many evangelical clergy were educated and nurtured outside of the university networks by schoolmasters and tutors, some of whom were themselves non-graduate. But these networks also have the potential to demonstrate much more about the flow of ideas and practice. For instance, I've been able to trace a source of total abstinence teetotalism in Anglican circles to John Barber's clerical seminary in West Yorkshire, where an ex-cowherdite, sometimes known as the Salford and Manchester Bible Christians, was reading for orders, and he seems to have converted both his tutor and his fellow pupils to the full abstinence cause. One of his fellow students, James Bardsley, would later author an influential report on intemperance for the Northern Convocation, and would influence a younger brother and 3 sons, a bishop and 2 cathedral canons, who were all to become Anglican temperance campaigners. And parish seminaries seem also to have been the hub for the transmission of an appreciation of the role of hymn singing in Anglican service, and indeed for the transmission of hymns. I've identified at least 4 tutors, one of whom had at least 80 pupils, who were the authors of and distributors of hymns for congregational use. So finally, to summarise, there were far more non-graduate clergy being ordained in this period than has been acknowledged. They were not exclusively confined to South West Wales or North West England, although in South Wales and the Northern Province they certainly formed a large proportion of the ordinance, so much so that in many places university-educated clergy were in the minority. Over the period it became harder for non-graduates to find ordination in the Southern Province, and after 1825 it became harder in the North. Non-graduates were not uneducated. They were not ordained fresh from the plough-tail. Instead of university, many undertook tertiary or pre-ordination preparation at specialist schools and with specialist tutors. And academically, they were able to compete with the graduates. Non-graduate clerical culture deserves much more attention. There were concentrations of clergy who did not share the elite habitus of university men and had no loyalty to the universities. They were embedded in alternative networks which need to be understood more fully if we are to understand the diffusion of cultural, political and theological ideas and practice in the period, and how the heterogeneity of its workforce may have contributed to professional discontinuities and the coalescence of church party. Quite simply, we need to take account of the collective biographies of non-graduate clergymen if we wish to understand how the church performed its mission amongst the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much.